The tuxedo was rented, the gun on his hip was not his, and the woman at the podium had no idea she had about 90 seconds left before the safest night of her calendar became the most dangerous night of her life. Marcus Cole stood at the back of a ballroom in the Hotel del Coronado, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in borrowed black tie, holding a glass of red wine he had not tasted and would not taste, and he watched 400 people in gowns and formal wear applaud a speech he had not heard a single word of. He'd already been asked twice that evening politely by two different guests if he could take their empty plates. He hadn't corrected either of them. Correcting them would have drawn eyes, and drawing eyes was the one thing he could not afford tonight. And anyway, he had spent his whole life being read on sight by rooms like this one, and he had made his peace a long time ago with letting a room believe whatever it needed to believe. Let them think he was staff. Let them think he was somebody's polite +1. Let them think anything at all, as long as not one of them looked at him long enough to wonder what he was actually doing. Because he wasn't watching the speech. He'd spent the whole evening listening to something else. The doors, 6 of them. The kitchen, and the 90-second gap after dessert when the corridor behind the ballroom went quiet and unwatched. The band and the half-beat of silence between songs where a room full of people all inhale at once. He'd been reading the room the way you read a page, and every line of it had said the same thing. Calm, calm, calm. And then at 47 minutes past 9, one line said something different. Not a sound, not a face. A change in the texture of the air, the specific way a large room shifts when something walks into it that does not belong. A thing Marcus could not have explained to anyone who had not been trained in the dark in countries with no names to feel the exact instant a room becomes a trap. His phone buzzed once against his chest. One word from the man he'd posted at the service entrance. Now. Here is what nobody in that ballroom would ever know, that the quiet man they'd mistaken for a waiter had once diffused explosives by feel in total darkness with 3 of his brothers bleeding out around him. That he carried a folded crayon drawing in the inside pocket of that rented tuxedo. That 18 months ago the world had rearranged itself around the absence of his wife and left a hole nothing had filled. And that he was about to move the most powerful woman in that room 4 minutes and 30 seconds through the belly of a hotel past a man who had come to take her without one of the 400 guests ever looking up from their dessert. This is the story of the driver everyone underestimated, and of the 5 weeks it took the world to find out who was behind the wheel. Marcus Cole woke at 5:00 a.m. the way he did every single day, not because an alarm forced him up, because his body had spent 12 years being taught to treat rest as a thing you borrow, and alertness as a thing you keep, and bodies don't forget that. Bodies never forget anything you'd give a great deal to be able to forget. He lay still and did what he always did first. He listened. Past the thin wall of the second bedroom came the soft, even breathing of his 9-year-old daughter Zoe, and Marcus lay in the dark of his small apartment in Chula Vista and listened to it the way other men listen to music. It was the sound that told him the night had passed without harm. It was the sound that reminded him why he was still here, still trying, still standing, still setting one boot in front of the other, down a road that some mornings felt too heavy to walk at all. The apartment was 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor of a building the color of weak coffee 4 blocks from the freeway. It was clean, and it was paid for on time every month, and the deadbolt he'd installed himself would have held against a truck. He got up without a sound and stood a moment at the window. Down in the lot, the same 3 cars. The neighbor's cat on the same wall. Nothing wrong. He'd checked and found nothing wrong, and he knew in the part of himself he could not switch off that. Nothing wrong was a temporary condition, and that the whole job of a man like him was to keep it temporary as long as possible. He'd learned that lesson twice over in his life, once in the service, and once just by being a large black man in America, where he'd understood since he was younger than Zoe that a situation could turn on you in a heartbeat through no fault of your own, and that the only protection was to see it coming first. Honey put coffee on. Black. He'd stopped taking it any other way a long time ago in a place where you learned to want less so that less could never be taken from you. There was a photograph on the refrigerator held by a magnet shaped like a strawberry that Zoe had chosen, and Marcus did not look at it every morning because some mornings he could not. It was Dana. Dana Cole had been an elementary school art teacher, the kind of person who could find the one good thing in any room and point at it until you saw it too. She'd taught 8-year-olds to mix colors and not fear a blank page. She'd married a man whose job she was allowed to know almost nothing about with her eyes open, and for a good while, the two of them had built something warm in the narrow spaces between his deployments. She had wanted more than anything a house with a red door. She used to say it like a joke and mean it like a prayer. When you're done saving the world, Marcus, I want a little house with a red door and a yard and a mailbox with our name painted on it wrong. She always said the name would be painted on wrong. It was the wrongness she loved, the proof a person had done it by hand. She had died 18 months ago on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 3 miles from home when a delivery van hydroplaned through a red light. Marcus had been at Zoe's school when it happened, standing at the pickup line holding a crayon drawing Zoe had run out to give him. The three of them, stick figures with enormous hands, in front of a house with a red door. He'd been looking at that drawing, smiling at it when his phone rang. He kept the drawing now. He'd had it laminated so it would never wear through, and he carried it folded in the inside pocket of every jacket he owned. And there was not one day in 18 months he'd left the apartment without it. A man who'd learned to travel light his whole life carried exactly one thing that could not be replaced. At 5:40, he made Zoe's lunch with the same focused, unhurried care he had once brought to work that could not afford a single mistake. Turkey and cheese crusts off-cut on the diagonal because on the diagonal was the only acceptable way. An apple sliced, a note on a napkin, one line every day, sometimes a joke, sometimes just, "You've got this bug," because Dana had done it, and because a child who has lost one parent should never open a lunchbox and find nothing of the one she has left. He'd learned to do Zoe's hair too off videos at 1 in the morning, in the months after Dana died, learned it right. Learned it, patient sectioning, and oiling and beating, because he understood in a way no video could teach that a black girl's hair is not a small thing, and that a father who couldn't manage it was telling his daughter something about herself he never wanted her to hear. It had taken him 100 tries. Zoe still corrected him, but he did it every morning, and he did it with love, and Ms. Carver at Loma Verde had told him once quietly that she could always tell the kids whose parents showed up in the small ways. Zoe's braids, she said, showed up. Hi woke Zoe at 6. She came awake the way she did everything all at once and full of questions, and the first that morning was whether octopuses could get lonely. "I don't know," Marcus said, which was true and which Zoe respected because her father was the one adult in her life who didn't pretend to know things he didn't. "We could look it up." On the way out, they passed apartment 3C, where Mrs. Tran lived, a small, sharp-eyed widow in her 70s who had decided without ever being asked that the quiet man in 3F and his motherless girl were now under her supervision. She opened her door as they passed the way, she always somehow did, and pressed a warm foil packet into Marcus's hands. Ban sweet dense, still warm. "For the girl," Mrs. Tran said, which is what she always said and which they both understood to mean for you too, but I know you won't take it for yourself. Marcus had stopped arguing months ago. You do not win with Mrs. Tran. Two people the world had each in its own way decided not to see clearly had quietly agreed to see each other. He dropped Zoe at Loma Verde Elementary, watched her run in with her too heavy backpack bouncing, and then Marcus Cole drove downtown to the strangest job interview of his life. The office was on the 32nd floor of a glass tower on the edge of the gas lamp, the kind of building where the elevators had their own concierge, and the air smelled faintly of money and cold stone. Marcus wore his one good jacket. In the inside pocket, the drawing. The security guard in the lobby asked to see his ID and his appointment confirmation, and then asked to see the confirmation a second time, and then radioed up to verify it before he'd let him pass the turnstile, which was not, Marcus noted without heat, a process he'd watched the guard run on the two men in suits who'd walked in ahead of him. Marcus had a lifetime of data on this particular friction. He didn't sigh, didn't stiffen, didn't give the guard a single thing to write down later. He just waited pleasant and still until the phone upstairs confirmed that yes, the large man in the lobby was in fact expected. It cost him 4 minutes and a small familiar tax he'd long ago stopped itemizing. Upstairs, a woman named Denise Okafor met him. She was maybe 50 silver at the temples, dressed with the surgical precision of a person who had learned that in her world a wrinkle was an argument you lost before you spoke. She was, though her card said only chief of staff, the gate through which nothing passed to her employer without her say-so. She had Marcus's resume on the glass table between them, and she looked at it the way you look at a puzzle you're not sure you want to solve. 10 years of private logistics consulting. Employer names redacted to black bars. References that couldn't be called until a clearance level was confirmed, and the clearance level was not one Denise had. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, "our employer has very specific security requirements, and I'll be honest with you because I think you're a man who prefers that we have people applying for this role with much more visible credentials. Former agency. Former police command. People whose careers I can actually read." She tapped one black bar with a nail. "Yours reads like a page somebody tore out." Marcus understood the subtext under the text because he always did. A black man with a decade of blacked-out history read differently to the world than a white applicant with the same page. The same gaps that made one man sound classified made another man sound like a risk. He'd carried that math into every room of his adult life. But he didn't say any of that. He simply said, "I understand." No offense taken, no defensiveness. And it was the way he said it, a man completely at peace with being underestimated because he'd had a lifetime of practice, that made Denise pause and for the first time look at him instead of at the paper. That was when the dog came through the door. It came in off the street at a dead run, a big shepherd mix, 60 pounds of panic, a snapped leash, trailing. It had bolted from a groomer 2 doors down, made it 3 blocks through downtown traffic, and it was past terror now into the blind place where an animal runs through anything. It shot across the lobby 32 floors below, straight for the open mouth of the parking garage and straight at a woman who just stepped out of a black SUV and was walking head down, thumbs moving entirely inside her phone. She did not see it. Marcus was moving before anyone in the room had finished understanding what was happening. Down the half flight, across the lobby, under 4 seconds, and he did not lunge and did not shout, because shouting spikes a panicked animal and lunging gives it something to run from. He simply arrived, angled his body sideways between the dog and the woman, dropped his weight low, and said 2 words in a voice pitched under the noise of the room. Low, flat, certain. The dog stopped. It sat. It looked up at him, sides heaving, and something in it let go. Marcus put one hand flat on its chest and felt the heart slamming, and held it there until the slamming slowed. The woman with the phone looked up. Her name was Victoria Hargrove, 44 years old, founder and chief executive of Hargrove Biosystems, a pharmaceutical logistics company that moved temperature-critical medicine across 40 countries, valued that quarter north of $4 billion. She'd been on the cover of 6 magazines and testified before Congress twice. She had grown up in a small stucco house in Phoenix with a mother named Ruth who worked a checkout counter by day and cleaned offices by night. She had built everything out of a sharp mind, a long memory, and a flat refusal to accept that the world had not been built for people like her. She had spent her whole life being underestimated. She knew the exact shape of it, the second glance, the verification call, the credential that had to be shown twice. She knew it the way you know your own handwriting. So when she looked up, she did not look at the dog. She looked at the man, and she saw in about a second and a half a person who'd put himself between her and danger without a half-beat of calculation, who did a violent thing gently and a gentle thing with total control. And she saw something else too, something she recognized in her bones. A man who had learned to make himself unthreatening in every register, even while doing the most competent thing in the room, because the world had taught him he had to. She knew that discipline. She'd built a company on her own version of it. She looked at Marcus Cole for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked past him to Denise, frozen by the elevator. "Hire him," Victoria said. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed on her, already looking back down at her phone. Denise looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the dog. The dog wagged its tail and thumped it twice against the marble as if the whole thing had gone exactly to plan. The dog belonged to no one they could ever trace. The groomer's client never came back, and it spent the rest of its life sleeping in the security office of a downtown parking garage, fat and beloved, answering to the name Lobby. He started the following Monday. The first 2 weeks were quiet. Marcus drove Victoria to meetings, to the airport, to dinners at restaurants where the smallest thing on the menu cost more than he spent on groceries in a month. More than once a valet or a maitre d' spoke past him to Victoria. "Will your driver be waiting outside, ma'am?" in the particular tone reserved for a black man in a suit standing next to money. And Victoria began quietly to notice the tone, because it rhymed with tones she'd been hearing her whole life, and it began to bother her in a way she filed and did not yet act on. She worked in the back seat. He drove in silence. When they spoke, it was brief and professional, but she was watching him. She noticed he adjusted the mirrors every time she got in, not once at the start of the day, but each time a small deliberate correction, the angles wrong for comfort and right for erasing his blind spots. She noticed he always knew which lane would move before the traffic app caught up, not guessing, but reading the brake lights, 3-4 cars ahead like a sentence. And she noticed the thing that unsettled her most, an afternoon when a delivery motorbike cut across 2 lanes and shaved the front bumper close enough to make her coffee jump. Every driver around them flinched. Horns. A curse. Victoria grabbed the door. Marcus's hands did not move on the wheel. His breathing did not change. His eyes tracked the bike until it was clear, and then he drove on as though the world had tried something and failed. There was another layer to that stillness that Victoria only half understood at the time and understood fully later. Marcus had spent his life not being allowed to react. A big black man who let anger show on a freeway, in a parking lot, at a traffic stop, was a big black man courting a story that ended badly for him, no matter who'd been in the wrong. He'd made himself calm so long ago and so thoroughly that the training the Navy gave him had simply moved into a house already built. When he didn't flinch at the motorbike, it wasn't only the SEAL in him. It was the boy who'd been taught at 10 exactly how to hold his hands and his voice so the world would let him get home. She asked him about the mirrors one evening at a red light. "Old habit," Marcus said. She let it go, but she filed it the way she filed everything. There was one night in the 3rd week that stayed with them both. They were on Harbor Drive after a late dinner meeting, when a patrol car pulled in behind them and rode their bumper for 6 blocks, then lit them up. Marcus signaled, pulled over slow and clean, and before the officer was even out of his cruiser, turned on the dome light, put both hands high and open on the top of the wheel, and said evenly to the back seat, "Ms. Hargrove, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Keep your hands where he can see them, and let me do the talking. Everything's fine." It was fine. Registration current plate clean. A young officer who ran the tags looked at the CEO in the back, decided the math didn't add up to anything worth his evening, and sent them on with a warning about a taillight that wasn't out. It took 4 minutes. Nobody's voice rose. Marcus's hands didn't leave the wheel until the cruiser's lights were gone from the mirror. Victoria sat in the back and watched the whole of it. Watched the practiced total stillness of a man who had clearly done this 100 times, who had a procedure for it. The way he had a procedure for everything dangerous, and she felt something turn over in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. It was the first time she understood viscerally that the composure she'd been admiring in her driver was not only a skill. Some of it was armor. He had needed it long before anyone handed him a rifle. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the thing itself. But after that night, she stopped thinking of him as the driver, even in the privacy of her own head. 3 weeks in Victoria came down with a brutal cold, 2 days before a flight to Washington for a congressional hearing. She did not cancel. She never canceled. But she came down to the car, gray-faced and hollow, running on nothing but will, and Marcus saw it in the way she held the railing. That night after he dropped her home, he stopped at a pharmacy on his own time and his own dime and left a small white paper bag outside her door, ginger tea, honey, a single packet of the correct decongestant, the one that wouldn't fog her before a hearing, and a note on plain paper in blunt block letters. Drink this before the red eye. It works. No signature. It didn't need one. Victoria drank the tea. She flew to Washington. She delivered 40 minutes of testimony without a single stumble. On the flight home, she tried to remember the last time somebody had done something for her with nothing attached. No ask, no angle, no invoice, no photograph of themselves being kind. She could not remember. The next morning on the back seat there was a small, purple stuffed octopus, a paper tag tied around one arm for Zoe, from VH. Marcus found it, stood there, a long moment holding it, set it carefully on the passenger seat, and said not one word about it, because some gifts are made smaller by being mentioned, and the not mentioning was how you said thank you to a person like her. Zoe named the octopus Captain. Captain slept on her pillow every night from then on, and a 9-year-old girl in Chula Vista carried, without knowing it, the first proof either of these two guarded, careful adults had offered the other that the door between them might someday open. The trouble began in the 5th week. A letter arrived at the legal office of Hargrove Biosystems. Handwritten, no return address, local postmark, and it referenced in precise detail a specific shipment route, a cold chain corridor moving a high-value cancer therapy that exactly 3 people inside the entire company were supposed to know. The letter made no direct threat. It simply described the route, origin transfer point window, the name of the bonded warehouse. And the meaning underneath, unspoken and unmistakable, was this: we know things we are not supposed to know, and we want you to know that we know. Curtis Briggs, read it first, head of corporate security, former federal agent, 22 years, a corner office, in a manner that suggested he'd seen everything twice. He read it, checked the postmark, and reached the conclusion he was paid to reach quickly: a disgruntled ex-employee cut in the last restructuring trying to rattle the boss. He wrote it up, flagged it low priority, and moved on to his afternoon. Marcus was in the parking garage when the security team debriefed. He couldn't hear a word through the glass wall of the conference room, but he'd spent a career learning that the body says what the mouth won't. Crossed arms, relaxed shoulders. A man leaning back. Papers squared and slid into a folder with the briskness of people who've decided a thing is over. They were done thinking about it before the meeting ended. Marcus sat in the parked car a long time after Victoria went up. Because the letter was wrong. Not the handwriting, the grammar of it. He'd read enough intercepted traffic and enough dark rooms to know the difference between grievance and reconnaissance, and they don't sound alike. Grievance is personal and loud even when quiet, and it uses the word I over and over because grievance is about the person writing it. That letter had used the word we. Grievance wants you to hurt. Reconnaissance wants to see how you move. That letter had not been written to frighten Victoria Hargrove. It had been written to watch what she did next. I knew, too, without any bitterness, that if he took this to Briggs, it would go nowhere, that the driver walking into the head of security's office to explain surveillance tradecraft would be received exactly the way the world tended to receive him, as a man reaching above his station. So he didn't waste the breath. He did what he'd always done. He handled it himself quietly and let the credit fall wherever it fell. For 3 mornings running, Marcus arrived 40 minutes early and photographed every vehicle with a sightline to the tower's entrance. He mapped the angles from the 2 public parking structures across the street. He timed the gap between the building security team's shift changes, 11 minutes reliable as a clock, which meant anyone who'd watched for a week knew it too. On the 2nd morning, he found it. A gray Honda Pilot, upper level of the structure across the street, nose out for a clean exit. There again the 3rd morning. Different plates each day, he photographed both. But the same vehicle, because of one thing: plates can't change a small dent above the rear right wheel, well shaped like a closed fist. The paint cracked white at its center. Different plates, same fist. That was not a disgruntled ex-employee. Disgruntled ex-employees don't rotate plates. Marcus made a phone call he had not made in 2 years. Ray Delgado had been on the Yemen mission, one of the 3 who ended up in the hospital and had walked out of the Navy afterward and landed steady now, married 2 kids as a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They didn't talk much anymore. Men who've shared the worst night of their lives sometimes can't, because to hear the other man's voice is to be back in the Wadi. And the Wadi is not a place you visit on purpose. But Ray picked up on the second ring, and when Marcus said his name, there was a pause, and then, "Cole, my God, you all right?" "I need a plate run," Marcus said, quietly, "and whatever comes back." He gave one number. He didn't explain. Ray didn't ask. That was the whole shape of what they were now, a debt so large in both directions that neither would ever name it, only pay it in small, silent installments, forever. What came back 2 days later was not small. The plate traced to a company that did not exist at a physical address that was a vacant lot behind a shuttered tire shop in National City. The company was linked through 3 layers of shell paperwork to an organization with a file. 2 executive abductions in Eastern Europe in the last 4 years. Pharmaceutical and logistics targets both. High-value ransoms. One executive had been returned 11 weeks later, thinner and permanently changed. The other had never been found. Marcus read Ray's message twice, sitting in the car with the engine off, and then set the phone face down on his knee and went very still. The way he went still when a situation got simple in the worst possible way. He was not looking at a grudge. He was looking at a rehearsal. He went to Denise, not Briggs. He asked for 10 minutes with Victoria. He got 15. He sat across the wide desk from Victoria Hargrove with the harbor going gold behind her, and he laid it out the way he'd been trained to brief men who held other men's lives in their hands. Facts first. Then interpretation, then recommendation. No drama, no alarm. He told her what the letter actually was. The shift gap, the sightlines, the pilot, the fist-shaped dent, the rotating plates. He told her, leaving out how that the vehicle traced to a shell that traced to an organization that had done this exact thing twice, and that one of the 2 people it had done it to was still 4 years later unaccounted for. Victoria listened without interrupting once. When he finished, she was quiet a long time. Then she asked the question he'd known since the second morning in the garage that he'd eventually have to answer. "Who are you, Marcus?" he told her. Not everything. Not the names of places that appeared on no map, not operations that had never been acknowledged and never would be. But enough. 12 years. SEAL Team 6, a rod of titanium in his left leg from a mission in Yemen that had ended with 3 of his brothers in a hospital, and one of them, a 24-year-old named Miguel Santos, not coming home at all. He'd seen this exact pattern once before in another country against another target. The letter, the watchers, the rehearsal, and the last time a security man had waved it off as a grudge, the people it was aimed at had not all come back. Victoria walked to her window, looked out over the harbor a long time. Then she said, without turning around, in a low voice, "You've been driving my car for 5 weeks, and in 5 weeks nobody, not Briggs, not one person on my security payroll thought to actually look at the man who's been 10 feet from me every day." She turned. They looked at the uniform of it, the driver, and they stopped there. "People usually do," Marcus said. There was no complaint in it. It was just a fact he'd built a life on top of. "I've found it's useful more often than not." Victoria did not smile, but something moved behind her eyes, the recognition of one underestimated person by another across a gap of money and circumstance that neither of them had ever quite been allowed to forget. She came back to the desk, picked up her phone, and called Curtis Briggs into the office, and she let him go, right there in front of Marcus. She was gracious. She was also final. Briggs had been careful, competent, and completely wrong about the one thing that mattered, and he left with a fair package and the look of a man who'd just watched a door close that he'd assumed he owned. She asked Marcus to stay. He restructured her security quietly and completely. He brought in 2 men he trusted without reservation. Tomas Okafor, no relation to Denise, though the coincidence made them both laugh once, a former ranger, enormous and unhurried, driving a forklift at a distribution center because civilian life had not yet found a shape that fit him. And a wiry, watchful former recon marine everyone called Van, with a memory for faces that bordered on the unnatural. Marcus changed Victoria's airport route, 3 routes now chosen the morning of never the same 2 days running. He identified the 2 positions near the tower with a clean line on the entrance and made sure anyone sitting in them was being watched right back. He rehearsed Victoria gently on small things, where to stand, while a car pulled up, which way to move, if he ever put his hand on her elbow, and said now. She didn't resist it, which surprised her. She'd expected to resent the loss of ordinary life. Instead, she found that being genuinely looked after, not flattered, not managed, looked after, was a thing she'd been starving for so long she'd forgotten it was food. 9 days after the first letter, the second one came. It came to her home. Only 5 people alive had that address. Victoria read it, standing in her own front hall in La Jolla, and for the first time since a scared girl in Phoenix had learned to be afraid of nothing, so the world could not use her fear against her. Victoria Hargrove felt genuine physical fear move through her body. She called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. I was at her house in 19 minutes. He didn't speed. He never sped. Speed is for people who didn't plan. And besides, he'd learned young that a black man doing 90 at midnight was a different kind of gamble than the mission ever was. He read the letter without touching more than a corner. Same hand, same grammar of reconnaissance. But it had moved from her office, which was public, to her home, which was not, and the move was the message. We can reach the places you thought were only yours. That night at her kitchen island at 11 o'clock, while Okafor did a slow walk of the property, Victoria did a thing she hadn't planned to do. She talked about Phoenix, about Ruth and the 2 jobs, and the specific sound of a woman coming home at midnight trying to be quiet so her daughter could sleep, and how Victoria had lain awake anyway every night listening, keeping something, the way this driver kept the road so at least one of them would always be watching. Marcus understood keeping. He had one asleep in Chula Vista who tried to do it for him. You have a daughter, Victoria said, not a question. She'd sent the octopus. Zoe, she's 9. Does she know what you were? She knows I keep people safe. She thinks it's a boring job. I've worked pretty hard to make sure she thinks it's a boring job. He turned his coffee a quarter turn on the counter. There's plenty I'll have to teach her about the world that isn't boring at all. Not yet, though. She gets to be 9 a little longer. Victoria looked at him a moment and understood at least the outline of what he meant, and did not pretend to understand more than the outline. Then, in the voice of a woman who'd signed away pieces of an ordinary life one contract at a time and only lately felt the weight of the stack, I'd like to meet her sometime, Zoe, if that wouldn't be strange. It was strange, the CEO and the driver, the space between them, mapped by salary and seating in the back of a car. But 2 weeks later on a Saturday, Victoria had cleared of everything for the first time in years. They met at the zoo because Zoe had opinions about the zoo. And Victoria Hargrove, who had testified before Congress and stared down boardrooms full of men who wanted her to fail, spent 45 minutes being cross-examined by a 9-year-old about whether octopuses get lonely, and answered every question with total seriousness and did not check her phone once. Captain says thank you, Zoe informed her gravely at the end. Tell Captain, Victoria said just as gravely, that the honor is mine. Marcus watched the 2 of them at the octopus tank and felt the door he'd been holding shut for 18 months move just slightly on its hinges. Then he went back to work. The men with the fist-dented pilot were still out there, and the gala was in 11 days. The gala at the Hotel del Coronado had been on Victoria's calendar for 4 months. A benefit for pediatric cancer research. She was keynote speaker and largest donor. Canceling was not on the table. Children's hospitals, she told Marcus flatly, do not stop needing money because someone mailed me a letter. He didn't argue. He'd have thought less of her if she'd folded. He worked the venue for 3 days. He drove the approach route at 3 different times, clocking the choke points. He walked the hotel twice, the grand old wooden Victorian with its red turreted roof, 400 rooms, and a warren of service corridors behind the public face, and mapped everyone the way he'd once mapped compounds. 4 exits that worked, 2 that only looked like they did. He learned the kitchen's rhythm from a banquet steward named Hector, a decent man with tired eyes, who knew the 90 seconds after dessert plates cleared was the deadest the back corridor ever got. Hun posted Van in this ballroom in a caterer's vest invisible. He posted Okafor at the service entrance because the service entrance was the soft place, and Okafor was not a soft man. He staged a plain gray sedan at the fire exit with a driver who knew to be ready and not to ask why. And he wore a rented tuxedo that fit well enough with the folded drawing in the inside pocket. When Victoria came down the grand staircase in a deep green gown, she saw him at the bottom in the tux and stopped, one hand on the rail, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It was not a moment either would ever mention. Then she reached the bottom step, and it was folded away with everything else, and they went to work. The evening ran smooth for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Victoria gave her speech, Luminous, a hospital in Phoenix, a mother who cleaned it at night, children who deserved better odds than they were handed, and 400 people put down their forks to listen. She raised from that podium a little over $9 million. Photographs were taken. Wine was poured. And somewhere in those 2 hours, 2 different guests, seeing a tall black man in black tie standing quietly near the wall, handed Marcus their empty plates, and Marcus took them without a word and set them on a passing tray, because a man who is invisible to a room can move through it more freely than a man who is seen, and he had decided long before tonight to make the room's assumptions work for him instead of against him. At 47 minutes past 9, he felt it change. Not a sound. Not a face. The texture of the air. His phone buzzed once. Okafor. Now. Marcus set down the wine he had not tasted and began to move. I did not hurry. This was the whole art of it. Urgency draws eyes. He walked as if crossing to the bar, as if the night were pleasant and the music fine, and he had all the time in the world, and here the invisibility cut both ways, and he knew it because a black man moving fast through a room like this one would be seen instantly and seen wrong, and so he moved slow and smooth and unremarkable, and not one of the 400 guests glanced up. He reached the podium just as the east door opened, and a man in a catering jacket that didn't fit him quite right stepped through and began unhurried to scan the room. Marcus reached Victoria under the cover of a table's applause, put his hand on her elbow, put his mouth near her ear, and pitched his voice under the music low and flat and absolutely certain. "We need to step away right now, quietly." Victoria had a prepared response for almost everything. She had exactly one response to that particular calm in Marcus Cole's voice. She nodded, set down her glass as though she'd finished it, smiled at the nearest table, and stepped away from the podium on his arm, and to anyone watching, it looked like nothing at all. What followed lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I took her not toward the lobby where the man in the wrong jacket was, but the other way through a swinging door into the service corridor he'd walked twice that afternoon, the one deadest in the 90 seconds after dessert. Dim, warm coffee and bleach and empty. Except it wasn't quite. A second man waited near the loading area. Not hotel staff. Marcus knew it the way you know a language you once spoke fluently, the stance, the hands, the flat readiness of a man who does this for money. He came off the wall as they entered. The confrontation lasted less than 20 seconds. No shouting. Marcus put Victoria behind him with one hand, without looking, the way you set down something you cannot afford to break, and then he closed the distance. The man expected him to keep the one thing men like that are never ready for, and it was over almost before it began. A single kitchen porter coming out of the walk-in with a tray of butter saw the last half-second, and later told investigators wide-eyed that it looked like the tall man in the tuxedo had simply touched the other man, and then the other man was on the floor. Not entirely accurate. Close enough. Marcus had never cared about being given credit for accuracy, or for that matter about being given credit at all. He guided Victoria through the fire exit. The gray sedan was there, engine-running, Okafor already folding his enormous frame into the front seat. They were on the Coronado Bridge, the city lights sliding below, before the hotel's own security had finished its first slow sweep of the ballroom and noticed the keynote speaker was gone. Marcus drove. Victoria sat in the back and breathed. She didn't speak for several minutes. Then, watching the water, "You planned for this." "I planned for the possibility," he said. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He said nothing. He drove. Behind them, 400 people were still eating dessert, and not one of them would ever know that Death had walked into the room in a catering jacket, looked around, and been walked back out the other door by the quiet man they'd handed their plates to. The investigation was larger than any of them had understood they were standing inside of. The organization behind the letters had been under quiet federal watch for over a year by a task force that had been trying and failing to get close enough to make a case. Marcus's fist-dented pilot and Ray Delgado's careful off-the-books plate run handed them the thread they'd been missing. Both men from the hotel were in custody by midnight, the one in the corridor and the one in the wrong catering jacket picked up in the lot before he reached his car. Neither was anyone. That was the point of men like them. They were the hands. The task force was after the arms, and now at last they had a way up. The internal source was identified within a week. A man in the legal department named Aaron Keller, mid-30s associate counsel, 3 years with the company, decent reviews, invisible. He'd needed money in the grinding, undramatic way. People need money. A divorce gone worse than expected, a mortgage on a house he could no longer carry alone, a second child on the way with a woman he was trying to make things right with. He'd told himself he was only selling information about routes, logistics. Nobody gets hurt by a schedule. He told himself that right up until the night a man in a tuxedo walked a woman out of a ballroom 4 minutes ahead of the people his routes had led inside. And then Aaron Keller sat in his car in his driveway and was sick because he'd finally understood what he'd sold. He confessed almost before they finished reading him his rights. Not a hard man, a weak one, which is more common and in its way more dangerous. Victoria did not hate him, which surprised her. She felt something closer to grief for the ordinary, solvable smallness of the reason a man had put a knife to the thing she'd spent her life building. She gave her statement with the precision of a woman who'd spent decades being the most prepared person in every room. When the investigators asked about her driver, how exactly an executive's chauffeur had detected a professional surveillance operation a 22-year federal veteran had filed as a grudge, Victoria was quiet a moment. Then she said simply, "He did exactly what was needed and nothing more." She said it without performance because it was the truest thing she could have said about him, and because she'd learned from watching him that the truest thing is usually also the shortest. What she thought and did not say was this: "And every single one of you walked past him for 5 weeks and saw a driver." 3 days after the gala, Victoria asked Marcus to meet her somewhere that was not a car and not an office. They sat at a picnic table in Balboa Park on a Tuesday afternoon. Her idea. He brought 2 coffees. She brought nothing, which meant she'd come only to talk, and they both understood that, and neither said it. She told him she'd pulled his service record. as much as was accessible, which wasn't much black bars and a rank and a list of decorations that stopped a person cold if they knew how to read it. She did not ask about the rest. She did not ask about Yemen or Miguel Santos or the things that still put him on his feet at 2 a.m. with his heart going like a fist on a door. She was far too smart to ask, and he understood slowly over the coffee, far too kind. Instead, she asked the question not one person had thought to ask him in 18 months. "You've spent your whole life watching out for other people," Victoria said. "Who watches out for you?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at his coffee. He looked at a little girl on a nearby swing being pushed by her father going higher, shrieking with the joy of a kid who trusts completely that the hands behind her won't let her fall. He thought about Zoe at a desk right now, drawing something with too many colors, asking Ms. Carver one question too many about the ocean. He thought about Ray, who'd run a plate at midnight without asking why. About Mrs. Tran and her warm foil packets. About a whole quiet economy of people who had decided one at a time to see him clearly in a world that mostly didn't. And then for the first time in a year and a half out loud to another living person, Marcus Cole said his wife's name. He said Dana used to, and then he had to stop. Victoria did not fill the silence. She did not reach across the table. She did not offer the kind of comfort that is really just an interruption. She simply sat with him in the afternoon light, the way you sit with a person carrying something enormous, not to carry it, only to not leave while he does. It was the most useful thing anyone had done for him in a very long time. Marcus kept the job. His title changed. Director of Executive Security now, with 2 men under him, a budget, and a real office he almost never sat in because he still preferred to drive. His contract changed. Zoe was added to the company's health insurance, and Marcus, who had spent his whole life refusing help. The way other men refuse charity, did not argue, because some things you accept not out of weakness but out of wisdom, and because a man who won't let anyone protect his child so he can feel strong is protecting the wrong thing. Victoria did not become a different person overnight. Still exacting, still occasionally impossible, still the sharpest mind in most rooms, and not shy about it. But she began quietly to do things she had not done before. She learned the names of the overnight security staff and their kids' names and asked about them. She started noticing and then naming, and then shutting down the small tones she'd let slide her whole career, the "will your driver wait outside" tone, the second glance tone, because once you have decided to see one person clearly, it becomes harder to keep not seeing everyone else. She called her mother in Phoenix on ordinary days. She kept her home address in fewer files. And she cleared on her calendar a recurring Saturday morning. Her assistant was under strict instructions never to fill a Saturday morning that sometimes had a 9-year-old and a stuffed octopus in it. Trust, Victoria was learning, was not a switch you flipped. It was a door you opened slowly, checking the hinges, testing the frame, making sure of the floor on the other side before you put your weight on it. Marcus understood this better than anyone. He'd been opening that same door himself, one careful inch at a time, since the rainy Tuesday 18 months ago when the world rearranged itself around his wife's absence and left a space nothing had filled. And he'd been opening a different, older door his whole life, the one you learn to keep half shut when the world has shown you over and over what it's willing to assume about a man who looks like you. Some mornings he still woke at 5 and lay in the dark and listened to Zoe breathe. But on those mornings now there was something new underneath the listening. Not happiness exactly. Not certainty. He'd stopped believing in certainty a long time ago in a country with no name. Something quieter than either. Something that felt, after so long feeling nothing at all, like the first faint shape of being all right. Captain the Octopus still slept on Zoe's pillow every night and still guarded the door. And one evening that spring, driving home over the bridge with the water going pink and gold on both sides, Marcus caught himself thinking about a small house with a yard and a mailbox and a name that would be painted on by hand, and therefore inevitably a little bit wrong. The house with the red door he thought could wait a while longer. But for the first time in 18 months it did not feel impossible anymore.